I can start?
Yep.
All right. Welcome, welcome. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. Welcome to Book Passage and another installment of our conversations with authors and writers. I'm your host, Paula Farmer, and thank you so much for supporting not only today's event, but your continued support of other events such as these, and also coming into the store and supporting the bookstore physically, supporting independent, local. We really appreciate it. And I always like to take this time to remind people that we are open in Corte Madera and also San Francisco at the Ferry Building. And we definitely welcome you coming through. Our booksellers love giving recommendations. And of course, our featured book today is top of the list, and we're happy to put that in your hand. And so do come into the store, or feel free if you feel safer or it's just more convenient to call up. We take online and phone orders. And also to let you know, September kind of kicked off the beginning of Book Passage, starting some in-store events. So we're really excited about that. And please notice that on our website at bookpassage.com, where we list all of our events. Definitely notice if it's an in-store event, if it's at Corte Madera, at Ferry Building in San Francisco, or if it is a virtual event. Most of our events are still virtual, and we're happy to keep that up, but we are incorporating some in-store events, so we'd love to have you come to those. Starting off with today's featured book, I want to give you a little background. Women have seemingly made many strides towards equality for decades, entering male-dominated spaces, including the workspace, classrooms, academia, and making a big dent in political arenas of late. But despite all that, there doesn't still seem to be much of a payoff. And I mean that literally, because the gender pay gap has held steady at about 20% since 2000. And the number of female CEOs for Fortune 500 companies has only been declining. It's actually not increasing. So our featured book, Machiavelli for Women by Stacey Vanek Smith, is kind of, I would say, the ultimate battle guide for our times, applying Renaissance principles, politics to the 21st century, and demands and demonstrations how women can take back and maintain that power in their careers. Stacey is a longtime public radio reporter and host. She currently hosts NPR's The Indicator, and she is a Planet Money correspondent. I'm sure that's where a lot of us know her, and we're so happy to have her here as she has served as a correspondent for NPR's Money, Planet Money, and Marketplace, and it's just kind of known in the NPR world, and we really appreciate that. Joining her today to moderate is Alana Samuels, who is the senior economics correspondent at Time Magazine, where she writes about work, gender, and inequality. She has previously been staff writer at both The Atlantic and the LA Times, and has reported, from 42 states and 5 countries. And she's actually joining us from the Bay Area. So please, at that point, I would love to give it over to you, Alana. Thank you both for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much,
I'm looking
Paula.
forward to learning.
Yes, definitely.
Finance and economics is not my strong suit, and I'm sure for a lot of women here, a lot of men as well. So we want to glean from you your gems.
That sounds great. And I'm sure Stacey would agree with me. I think so many women think that, and economics is really everything. So we can probably get into that as we talk. So Stacey, I am so excited to talk to you about this book because I thought it was so fun and useful. I think we have there are books about, women at work. But I think the really fun thing about this is that you have this advice and for women, but it's also coupled with this really fascinating history of this guy who lived 500 years ago, who people still know about now, Machiavelli, and kind of the people in his world, his life, and how we can take those principles and apply them to women in the workplace. And I just found like some of these examples of what his life was like and what he was doing, they're just so interesting. And I just knew nothing about this. So I thought it was wonderful. Great job.
Thanks, Alana.
So I'm wondering, I'm sure you've reported a lot about, inequality in the workplace and how women don't make as much. I think there was even some news out today that the pay gap shrank by like 1 cent or something. So it's still insane.
One song.
Exactly. So when was it that you kind of thought, you know what, Machiavelli would be a really good way to talk about this issue?
It's an excellent question because it's not a natural fit. You don't think, women in the workplace and Machiavelli, but actually Machiavelli part came a little later. The project started because I was just doing some reporting for NPR about the pay gap. And I was talking with an economist about it. And, so the pay gap is about 20%. So for every dollar a man earns, a woman earns about 80 cents. For Black women, it's about 63 cents on the dollar. And for Indigenous and Latina women, it's about 55 cents on the dollar. So like half. And the economist just said as a side comment, she's like, well, and this has been stuck for like 20 years. And I was like, it's been stuck for 20 years? Because, I've been reporting over 15 years that I've been covering business and economics, women going to law school in greater numbers, breaking into new fields, like the whole startups in Silicon Valley, kind of equalizing things, all this stuff. And I was like, how is this not manifesting itself? And then when I started looking into it, it wasn't just the pay gap. It was the number of CEOs. It was, it just seemed like in all of these different areas, these numbers were sort of frozen in time. So I was talking this over with my editor, and I sort of had, this idea kind of swirling around in my head about a book. But as one of my editors at Planet Money used to say, it was a topic, not a story. And so I was sort of talking through these ideas, and she's like, yeah, it's almost like women need Machiavelli. And I was like, because what I had said to her was, every time economics papers often will have conclusions, but the conclusions almost always involve policies changing, like government policy or companies implementing policies that will make change. And I was like, yeah, but, what happens if policy doesn't change? And what happens if you work for a company? I work, like, NPR is relatively woke, but, still have issues also. And a lot of the companies I cover are not even trying to be woke, especially like fields that, women and people of color and marginalized workers are kind of new and breaking into. They might really not have policies in place. So I was like, well, what can you do on an individual level? I just wanted to feel like I had options. So yeah, and my editor was like, it's almost like women need Machiavelli. It was like this light went off. So I bought a copy of The Prince. And I went to a coffee shop over the weekend. This was pre-COVID, so back when you could just go to coffee shops and it wasn't like an event. And it's just a short little, 60 pages. It's a short little book. And I read it from cover to cover in the coffee shop. And as I was reading, I was making all these, I got so excited. I almost couldn't believe how many connections there were.
So right away when you read it, you were like, hey, I could use this, or women could use this in general.
Yes, because in the very, very beginning of The Prince, I think the thing that really like I sort of felt like my brain kind of like lit up like a Christmas tree. I was like, oh, because in the very beginning of The Prince, he writes that there are two kinds of princes. There's the inheriting prince and the conquering prince. And he says for the inheriting prince, things are pretty cushy because everybody knows, his family's name. They kind of like, he's just sort of the default. Everyone's like, oh yeah, that guy. For the conquering prince though, who's like new to power, it's very troublesome, right? People are questioning, like, why are we paying taxes to this guy? Why are we letting him make the rules? The power's quite unstable. You're new to power. Everybody's questioning you, challenging you. And I was like, that has a lot of parallels with a lot of people in the workplace who are new to the workforce in a certain respect, or certain kinds of jobs or certain kinds of positions where like possibilities are suddenly open, but so are all the challenges to power and challenges to changing dynamics and things like that.
Yeah, I love the phrase "suddenly" because it's like women have been coming into the workplace for like
suddenly
so long, and it's still, like you say, it's still this new thing where women are kind of the conquering prince, where you have to prove yourself, and you're not getting anything kind of for granted.
Women didn't even have a credit card until the 70s. I mean, women and minorities have just been like locked out of the economy in all kinds of ways. The workplace is one of them, but access to the economy, access to money, access to like power at work. I mean, those are sort of like the levers of power in American society. And so I think getting there is important.
Yeah. One thing I thought was really interesting is, I think the other book, that's really well known for talking about women in the workplace is Lean In, but it's such a feminine-ish instruction, like lean in, like don't stomp, or and the advice is useful, but I love this idea of like, no, don't lean in, like be Machiavelli, like it's not, scheming isn't really the right word, but like be armed and like be a conqueror, don't just lean. Was it hard to kind of, balance telling women to, be kind of Machiavelli schemer and not going too over the top, with those tips?
Don't strangle anybody. I mean, actually, a lot of the advice was hard for me to give, but I made like a promise to myself when I started the book that I had been really frustrated because I'm a person who likes homework. So whenever I was going into a negotiation or was frustrated with where I was in my career and wanted to like push into something else, I would read a lot of books. I would read books and get advice. And the advice was not working for me, and including Lean In, which I did really like when I read in a lot of ways and was useful. But I felt like it was either sort of very girl bossy, it's like, just go in and like tell them what you're worth and go get yours, girl, which didn't work for me on many, many levels, but I did try things like that. And then I also read a lot of advice and negotiation oriented towards, it was just the, whatever regular books, but they, I guess, were oriented towards men. That really backfired. And so I was like, I just want options. I want to know the truth, but the truth, in a lot of the cases, I looked at a lot of research and a lot of data, but a lot of the data and research is cringy, right? It says like if women smile and emphasize a social connection in a negotiation, the negotiation is likely to go better. I mean, that seems like actually pretty solid general advice. I mean, you're not going to go scowling into a negotiation and like throw coffee on someone or something, but that wasn't advice I love to give. But I wanted people to at least like have the truth according to the best research I could find, and like it just have some options. And a lot of the options are, like you said, a little bit like sneaky, a little underhanded, because there are these expectations around how women are supposed to behave. And when women behave counter to that, they're often punished or disliked. And when women behave in accordance with that, they're often seen as like not leadership material. So you're walking this weird line, and it does take often some finessing. And so I just wanted to present like all the information that I had. So people, does this mean you have to smile in an interview? Like, no, of course not. But I at least wanted people to have that information so they could, have some tools, because I didn't have those tools. And I had some like pretty disastrous, I like tried to talk about a lot of my own disastrous experiences because they were really a lot of what led me to write the book and be so interested in all the research around it.
Yeah, I love the hot box. You talk about being a kid and playing baseball and being kind of stuck between first and second as they're throwing the ball back and forth. And you're going to be out, but you just have to keep running. And, you know, I love those little kind of descriptions that you talked about. Can you talk a little bit more about one of the experiences you had that really kind of motivated you to want to write this? Personal experiences?
Yes. I mean, definitely. I mean, one of the things I think that, so my whole career's been in media. So that's the sort of the main perspective I have, although I've covered a lot of different fields. My own personal experience has all been in journalism and media. And one of the things you notice in media is, especially broadcast, which is where my experience is that there are the people who are like on mic, which are just referred to as talent. And then there are the people who are behind the scenes, the producers, the editors, the engineers. I mean, an enormous amount of work goes on behind the scenes. And then, I mean, this was, I don't know if you watched the Mary Tyler Moore Show, but there was like Ted Baxter, who was like basically like a very handsome hairdo. And like, it was all sort of smart people in the back room writing copy for him, which he would then like often misread and stuff. That is not true anymore, of course, but there is some truth still to the fact, like to, you know, the talent positions, the on mic positions, the on camera positions are generally very competitive. A lot of people go into the field wanting to have those positions. And often like the editor, the producers, those are much harder positions to fill. So I started out as a producer. I really wanted to be a reporter. I wanted to be on mic. And I wanted to be talent. I really did. And I would see people around, you know, I could see after 15 years, you see the arcs of people's careers. And I would just notice that men would be given chances often much more quickly. And the thing is, like, it's not like the men weren't working hard or that they weren't actually talented. I mean, they were. But I would just see women who were also very talented, you know, getting encouraged to be behind the scenes, getting encouraged to be editors, getting encouraged to be producers, not getting the same chances. Or even if they got a chance, the reaction to their work, even if I felt like it was good work, was never quite, you know, and it was confusing because they were sort of individual things. It's like, well, maybe, you know, yeah, maybe like whatever, maybe this woman's not as great as this guy, or there are subtle differences, there are ways to justify it. But just when I looked at it holistically, I was like, wow, men are really getting way more opportunities than women are, way faster. And then for myself, so I started out as a producer on the graveyard shift, which is like a very typical entry-level job. And I was reporting in my spare time. I was like working all the time and reporting. And I kept applying for reporter jobs as they came up because I wanted that to be my full-time job. And I just kept getting told no and told that my work wasn't quite like special enough, which at the time I believed, it seemed plausible. But when I quit, which is one of the stories I tell in the book, I saved up a bunch of money and I quit. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go freelance. This is going to happen. Because I kept applying for reporter jobs and kept getting told that it wasn't like my work wasn't quite up to where it needed to be. The second I quit, they put me on a reporting contract. And what I realized was that I was just really useful where I was. And it was just going to create a problem if they made me a reporter. But I just saw that happen to women and continue to see it happen to women, people of color, other marginalized workers. It's like a very subtle, weird thing. But when you then when you sit back and look at the data, which is why I think I find data so useful in cases like these, because it gives you a context, because it's like, well, I don't know, maybe my work really wasn't up to snuff. It's totally possible. Of course, I think my stuff is genius, but everybody does. So it was an interesting moment for me when I quit and they were like, okay, well, let's get you on a reporting contract. Can you start Monday? And I was like, what? I mean, I was so shocked. And like a year later, I was hired on permanently as a reporter. And I think they just like, you know, I think I was just useful where I was. And I wasn't necessarily going to be given the same opportunities that I might have. And I don't know. I mean, it might have played out exactly the same way if I'd been a man. And certainly, you know, I was very privileged on a whole bunch of counts, and it was still a struggle. I mean, I can't imagine the barriers.
I mean, it had to be quitting that's so interesting that quitting is what like jump-started your career.
Quitting is what jumped. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I was like privileged to be able to quit. Like if I'd had dependents, if I'd been in a ton of debt, like I couldn't have done that. Even having that option reflects enormous privilege that if I hadn't been able to do it, I'm sure I would not ever have become a reporter.
And I know you have an example in the book of you were sitting with beers with two friends after getting hired at a radio job, and the man was getting like $15,000 more than you. And I think there's a black, standing desk. The black woman was getting like $5,000 less. And you know, that's data right there. But I also remember you telling me about like women in radio, if their voice is too high or too low, they get criticized. So it seems like there are just all these biases that are so hard to really do anything about.
They creep in all kinds of ways. In radio, it comes down to voice. I'm sure in TV, there are lots of ways that you get told, like, you don't sound, you know, for women in radio, it's voice. It's like, you need to sound more authoritative. I mean, I did like weird core exercise. To this day, I could not locate my core on a map. Like, I don't know if a core is actually a real thing. I think it's mythical, but I would try to do these core exercises to deepen my voice.
Because it was a deeper voice is more masculine and like authoritative?
I mean, I had a producer tell me, and I am by no means an exception, that I needed to try to sound more authoritative, more male, and to try to sound more like Walter Cronkite. But, you know, everybody gets told this. I mean, and like for people of color, they often get told in all kinds of weirdly subtle ways to sound like whiter. I guess we're all just trying to sound like Walter Cronkite at the end of the day. But it's, but yeah, I mean, but, you know, it would be listener letters too. Like a lot of people would write in and say I sounded like a cheerleader. In very early, I've like learned to not really read those letters, but like young female producers of color will still come to me often in the very early parts of their career and be like, you know, I'm getting letters that I sound like an airhead, or that I sound like I don't know what I'm talking about, or that I don't sound educated. That's something that like young producers of color will get, that I don't sound educated. I mean, and I think the listeners often write in thinking that they're having, and these are public radio listeners, right? It's like a very sort of like woke audience, you know, basically. And, you know, people get these messages. I don't think they're intentionally racist or sexist, but this is like unconscious biases is where a lot of this stuff comes in. I'm sure I did sound like a cheerleader to whoever was listening and wrote in. They're like, why is this like Flibberty Gibbet talking about wheat futures or whatever I was talking about? But I think they're unconscious reactions. And I think that's where a lot of the difficulty comes in. You know, people think they're just it's like, well, listen, like just objectively speaking, she doesn't sound authoritative and he does. She doesn't sound educated and he does. It's right. Just my objective opinion. And
when does that go away? Like, as you said, you know, when women are graduating, you know, I think college at higher rates. There was this Atlantic story, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago by Hannah Rosen called The End of Men. And it was basically arguing that like men are over, like they're all, you know, dying and getting on drugs and
men are over. Right.
And it's like, okay, if men are over and women are better at school and women are more organized and all this different stuff, when does that bias switch? And when do they not want you to sound like Walter Cronkite anymore, but they want you to sound like, to use a dated reference, Connie Chung, you know, like, I don't know what makes those unconscious biases go away. And maybe it's women have to act like Machiavelli and that's how we'll do it. But it seems like so much of it is these biases that have just been around for so long that don't seem to be going anywhere.
I mean, I honestly think for the needle to really move on this stuff, it probably does have to be at a policy level or like a company level. I think it starts with like an emphasis on diversity in hiring. I think that's where it has to start. And, you know, there are all kinds of hiring practices companies can employ to like reduce biases. You take names off of resumes, like all kinds of things that can help. And I think it is so insidious and difficult because we don't necessarily realize it's there. And one of the studies I read that has really stuck with me was that people who don't think they're biased actually show more biases. And this is also true of workplaces that claim that they do not have like any kind of problems with, you know, diversity and inclusion actually have a worse track record. Their pay gaps are worse. I think this is just, you know, as David Foster Wallace, a very smart white man, once said, the water we swim in, like it's hard to see sometimes. And so I think for things to really move, probably it does have to be policy and at a company level. But at an individual level, there are things that can happen. And like when individuals get into management positions and hiring positions and power positions, then you can sort of like consciously start to make changes at companies. But like that has to happen first. And that's kind of what hasn't been happening, the stuckness. I think it is happening. I think it will take time. I mean, change doesn't happen overnight. And, you know, in 10 years, no one will want, I mean, I would be shocked if in 10 years people were like, you should sound like Walter Cronkite. He was an amazing broadcaster. But also, you know, I think those things are changing in certain ways fast, but not as fast as you'd think. I don't know.
Oh, I mean, you know, for 40 years at least since women have been, I mean, I remember when I was, you know, we're about the same age and my mom was putting me in daycare and there just wasn't daycare for working moms, you know, like she had to just find one, but that was more than 40 years ago or about 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about the policy side, because one of the interesting parts of the book, I think you talked about Hollywood and writers' rooms. And, you know, I think Hollywood has a system where they have these kind of like diversity hires. You know, if you watch 30 Rock, they have that character Toofer, who's like the diversity hire because he's Black and he went to Harvard or something, or Black and gay. And, you know, you talk to these people who these studios have these diversity hires, and then people find out they're the diversity hires and they're like, I don't want to be a diversity hire. I want to be like the hire for me because I'm good. And you talk to some people who, you know, really, really had trouble with that. So is there is diversity hire kind of a way to do it? Or is there a way that you think, you know, we could kind of shake up these unconscious biases that doesn't have a blowback, I guess?
I mean, that's a great question. So in the book, I talked with Adele Lim. She was the screenwriter for Crazy Rich Asians. And before that, most of her career, though, for 20 years, she was working in TV writers' rooms. And she grew up in Malaysia. So this was like a very foreign culture to her, like coming into I mean, she went to college in the US, but just the whole crazy Hollywood thing. And the writers' rooms are their own. I mean, the stories she has are just, I could have talked to her for like a straight week just about the crazy writers' rooms. I mean, they sound amazing. But
Wait, can you tell me one example?
I mean, a lot of it was just, you know, oh my gosh. I mean, mostly like some of the stuff was just so, she just said like they would just have these long discussions about strip clubs was like a huge thing. It was super bro-y, and it was like strip clubs. And then there was some really horrific glossary of like sexual positions and terms that they would refer to. And like, she's the only woman in the room while these things are being like openly talked about. People would talk over her, steal her ideas. And so she basically, but by like sheer force of like talent, and also I just think like perseverance, just sitting there in a room full of like men talking about a strip club they went to the other night and like trying to introduce story ideas is just, I mean, that is an amazing situation. But it was the situation she was in, and this was the career she wanted. It's a really desirable career. It's incredibly competitive, and there's a lot of insecurity. And so, of course, there are these like weird barriers to entry. But yeah, so her first writer's job, she said they had minority positions set aside, and her agent came to her and was like, "You've got a writing job." It was like on a detective show. And she was over the moon. It's so hard to get these jobs. And then she found out she was like the minority hire, and she went back to her agent and said, I don't want to be the minority hire. I want to just be hired because I'm great. And what her agent said, and I have to say, I've thought about this a lot. He was like, listen, you take the in you get. You didn't go to college with these guys. You can't go to strip clubs with these guys. You didn't write for the Lancet with these guys. Like, you know, you just like take the in you get. And I think that, and she said, you know, in retrospect, that was really smart, because it's so, I mean, I feel like I have had that reaction to things too, where I'm like, I don't want to be the woman. I just want to be so great that my, like, you know, I cannot be denied. And in a system that is unfair and biased in a lot of ways. I think when there is an in, you take it. And
it worked for her, right? I mean, it worked for her until she got a offer to do the second Crazy Rich Asians and got got offered 1/8 of what the male co-writer. So it's like, you go over one hurdle and then there's just going to be another one, which is very depressing.
Yes. I mean, it really is. And the fact she walked away from the sequel to Crazy Rich Asians after she'd written this hit movie, and the fact that Warner Brothers, they had a reason, they were like, well, you're pretty new to movie writing, even though she had 20 years of TV writing experience. And that was the reason that they gave, but they offered her $100 and something thousand. The movie grossed 200 million worldwide. It was this smash hit. She was a huge part of why it was. And for that just to be denied. And in fact, her male writer, this is so interesting. So the man, she'd written it with a white man who had a lot of screenwriting experience. He got offered $800,000. He offered to split his pay with her so that they were essentially paid equally. And she said no. She's like, this isn't about the white guy earning less. This isn't about someone making less. This is about my talent being recognized on par with his talent. And that I loved, because I think a lot of times in the workplace, a lot of what causes all these problems is there's a feeling like the economy or the workplace is a zero-sum game, where it's like, if I get more money, that means less money for you. Or if Ralph gets hired, that means I'm not going to get that position. But really, when the economy grows, when workplaces grow and make more money, it's actually, it benefits everyone. The workplace can get bigger. The economy can get bigger. There's not a tiny pie that we're all carving up. But it's easy to be in that mind frame, Right,
but it's not a pie, as you say. But
it's not a pie.
You said a lot of people came to her and said, thank you so much for doing that. And they really admired her. But do you know what happened? Is she doing other writing or did quitting jumpstart her career too?
She got, it opened a ton of doors, and she's in Canada directing a movie right now, I think, for Lionsgate. She directed Raya and the Last Dragon, the hit Disney movie. And her career completely, it totally, I think, transformed her career, and she loved it, and she loved the crew, and she was the writer on set. So she went to Asia to film. They filmed in Singapore. And I think she was really heartbroken to turn it down, but it did open a lot of doors. I think the movie opened a lot of doors for her. And I think the fact that she said one of the things she was worried about was that when news of this got out, people would think she was difficult and not want to work with her. But she said that she has not experienced that mostly people's reactions has been what is wrong with Warner Brothers? Why would they mess with their secret sauce and let someone walk away for what in studio terms amounts to not very much money? And that was definitely my reaction. I wasn't wow, what a diva. I was just what is wrong with them? But she did get that warning from a lot of people.
Yeah. Talking about kind of, pay and salaries, and you have a whole section of the book about negotiation. And I thought it was really useful because, as you say in all these studies say women get less than men. If you take women's and men's names off resumes and swap them, people think the resume with the man's name is more qualified. So can you maybe for the listeners go over some of what you came away with from Machiavelli about negotiation? If you were Adele Lim and you were trying to negotiate right now, is there 3 things that you would say off the bat? Hey, Machiavelli says do this and you're going to be a little bit better off maybe.
I think so. Negotiating has not been a strength of mine ever. I hate it. The degree of anxiety, I feel like I've spent most of my career either angry at myself for not negotiating, angry at myself for the way I negotiated, puzzled at why some attempted negotiation didn't work out. And I have to say, when I looked at the research, it was upsetting, but there was a lot of relief in it. So women ask for more about 1/5 as often as men do, which seems really damning. And I think a lot of women will blame themselves. I certainly have. It's why I should ask for more? Why don't I go in and negotiate? I need to fight for myself. But then the data shows us that women are often punished for asking for more. If a woman asks for more money in a job negotiation, she's automatically considered less desirable to work with, like not taking into account how she asks. I mean, pounding on the table or just apologizing or whatever it is, like you ask for more, you're viewed as kind of selfish or like grabby in a way that if a man asks for more, even if he doesn't get more, it's like, yeah, good for him. He's just trying to get his. That's great. I mean, it's just seen very differently. And so once I saw that, I was like, oh, actually, I was being quite Machiavellian by not asking for a raise. I saw what the potential drawbacks were to asking for more. I saw that the likelihood of me getting more was maybe in question, and you just make a calculation, right? So we're all making calculations. So then the question becomes like, how can you ask for more while minimizing the downside? And the basic answer I came up with, which is, I guess we'll call tip number one, pro tip number one, power tip number one. One thing when I was reading a lot of like a lot of kind of advice for men around negotiation, the word power gets used a lot. So it's very funny. In like negotiation guides are like power tip number one. Anyway, power tip number one, I would say is to not make it antagonistic. So I think you kind of go into the negotiation looking at it as like a relationship. I mean, it is a relationship, right? This is a place where you're hoping to grow. You're hoping that they will give you opportunities and that you will be able to contribute your work. I mean, this should be like an actual relationship. It's not like wash the dishes or I'm divorcing you, right? I mean, it's like, I really would appreciate it if you would wash the dishes. I mean, it's much more like a relationship. So to approach the negotiation, instead of saying, let's say you want like $10,000 more and a promotion, just to say like, I'm so excited about the work I'm doing here. I'm really excited about, the way this company is doing X, Y, Z. I really want to be a part of that. I see myself moving into being a part of that. I think if you look at my work over the last year, you'll see that my productivity is up 10%. And I was really proud of this project and this project. And I'm so excited about my future here. I really think I'm at the top of my current job description. I want to feel like I'm being valued at this company the way I really value being here. I think my salary and job title are out of date now, if you look at what I'm doing. And I think now I should be in X position earning X amount of money. How does that sound to you? And so it's more of a conversation. So that's advice, power tip number one. Power tip number two, I would say, is it's not just about the money. That was like a revelation when I read this. It's like, and this is actually negotiation advice that comes from all over the place, including Negotiation Genius, which is an amazing book by two scholars out of Harvard, geared towards men. It's geared towards humans. It's really good. But one thing they advocate is this thing called log rolling. And log rolling is basically, you think of like 10 different things that you want out of a negotiation. So let's say you want $10,000 more, you want a promotion, maybe you want a bigger office. Maybe you want a 4-day work week. Maybe you want to work from home. Maybe you want to go to a conference in Austin in September. You think of 10 different things to ask for. And at moments of conflict or when it feels like the negotiation is dead ending, you throw in another thing. And like research finds that negotiations end up being far more productive and going better, and people end up getting more, the more elements they introduce. I have to imagine there's like a limit to that. I mean, if you introduce like 100 elements, but it just gives
like, oh, if I can't have a corner office, how about a 4-day work week? Like kind of subbing.
Yes, exactly. So let's say, you come to me and you're like, listen, I think I should be making $10,000 more. And I say to you, as companies always say, well, listen, you do great work and we really value you, but like our budget's really tight right now and we just don't have the money for it. And be like, okay, well, it's, I've done a lot of market research. I think, what I'm asking for is fair. I know what this company tends to pay for this work. I know that budgets can be tight. I would be willing to take, maybe $7,000 or $8,000 more, if maybe I could have some flexibility on Fridays because I want to explore this other project and this would give me a chance to do that. Like I would feel comfortable with that. How does that sound to you?
It's not like stepping back and saying, okay, not that, then this. It's kind of like X plus Y can still equal $10,000.
You're kind of like, it's like a little bit of a massaging thing. I mean, it's not like, listen, I will do half the dishes if you sweep the floor. It's more of a like, okay, well, listen, I'd really appreciate if you do the dishes. Like, is there a part of the dishes it's more of a like a little bit of a dance, but you're basically pulling the negotiation out of a sort of high noon style face off and making it more of a conversation, more holistic. And you're sort of looking at your whole job and your whole career as opposed to like narrowing it down to one thing. And my third piece of advice is so boring, so I saved it for last, is just do like maximum homework. That is
I think
number one piece of advice from everyone, is like get as much information as you can, because a lot of bias lives in this sort of foggy, nebulous area, right? Where it's like, oh, I don't know, like she just seems a little less qualified. So you need to get concrete information. So like ask your colleagues what they make. One trick because I ask people about money a lot, is to ask for salary range. Be like, do you mind just telling me a salary range for your position? I'm about to go in for a negotiation. People really want to help. Really want to help. And a colleague of mine says she reaches out to men on LinkedIn at like other companies like hers and explains, I'm about to go into a negotiation. Can you help me? She said like 80% of the men, she just reaches out to people she doesn't know, are like, absolutely, this is so important. Here's how much I make. Here's how much I made when I started. People want to help. And money is hard to talk about, but I think people understand what's going on. People want to help. I mean, if someone came to you and said like, someone else in your office and said like, Alana, I think I'm not getting paid enough. I'm going in for a negotiation. I'm not quite sure what to ask for. Like, would you mind telling me what your salary, like the range for your position is, what you know of it? I mean, I feel like you'd be inclined to want to help.
Yeah, it certainly, because it probably helps me too in the long run if, everyone's kind of sharing data and information. And as you say, kind of the more information you have, the better armed you are for that kind of negotiation.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things I thought was so interesting about this is that as you write, Machiavelli was writing this book from exile. He'd kind of lost everything. And he's sitting there writing this letter to basically the people that took over. And so can you tell me talk a little bit about that and how, kind of he's not in a position to be being like, I know how to win, because he kind of lost, but somehow this advice in this book has lasted for such a long time. So just talk a little bit about that and why you think it's been so, so everlasting.
I mean, I think my research into initially Machiavelli wasn't really going to be in the book. I mean, I was going to use tips from the Prince, but I started reading about him and I became so sort of fascinated and enchanted by his life. And so that he ended up being pretty prominent in parts of the book. So the amazing thing about the Prince is at the time Machiavelli wrote the Prince, he was like destitute. The Prince was a cover letter. The Prince was 100% a cover letter. He was trying to get his job back from people who had taken everything from him. So this was at a time of Italian city-states. So basically Florence was its own little republic. Like the city of Florence was its own little republic. And Machiavelli was essentially like the Secretary of State. So they would send him all around to try to negotiate with like the King of France and the Pope and various generals and things like that. So, and popes knew his name, kings knew his name. He's kind of a big deal. And he was from not a great family. So it was sort of a coup that he'd gotten this job. And he loved it. By all accounts, he was really good at it. He was very admired. He worked his heart out. Florence didn't have really any money or an army. So he was always negotiating, but Florence was always very vulnerable. I mean, Machiavelli had his wits to protect Florence, but Florence ultimately was very vulnerable. And ultimately the Medici family took over and Lorenzo de' Medici took the helm of Florence. And it was like, I guess he was like a despot. So anyway, Machiavelli lost his job, all his money got taken away from him, and he was thrown in jail and tortured and run out of town. He just lost everything. I mean, he was living the life. There are all these letters from him where he's ordering super expensive clothes. He was apparently kind of a dandy. He was very charming. He loved ladies. He was just the life of the party. Everyone loved Machiavelli, and he was like broken. I mean, they tortured him. He thought he was going to die. And then they exiled him. So he moved into this little tavern and brothel that his dad had owned outside of Florence.
Which you visited, by the way, correct?
Which I visited. It's so beautiful, but you can see the whole, it must have tortured him because you can see the whole city of Florence like spread out. And it's like a 10-minute drive now, but it was a day's journey then. And it's so beautiful. It's still there. It's a tavern. Like they said, it's the oldest tavern in Tuscany. I don't know if that's true, but
can you still get like a beer there?
Oh yeah. They actually, the food is really good. They have these like big Tuscan steaks. Apparently Machiavelli loved his steak cooked in wine. That was his thing.
Not a vegetarian then.
He was the opposite. I mean, it would be weird if Machiavelli were a vegetarian, honestly. He liked his steak, apparently. But he wrote The Prince, and it was to Lorenzo de' Medici. And if the first part of The Prince, it almost turned your stomach. He's just like, you're so amazing and I'm not really worthy. And you probably don't even have time to read this. But like, if you would, like, this is the best advice I have from all my years of experience. I mean, he's writing the guy who took everything from him. And like, it's crazy, but he wanted back in the fold. And what he was hoping would happen was Lorenzo de' Medici would read The Prince and be like, this is brilliant. I don't care who this guy is or who he used to work for. He's coming back to work for me. It did not work. Lorenzo de' Medici never read The Prince. Maybe didn't even look at it. But what happened was that everybody freaked out at the advice in this book. The Catholic Church threatened to excommunicate anyone who owned the book. And Machiavelli saw himself like just smeared everywhere. Like he was horrified and I think shocked. I mean, I think he thought like, here's my work of genius. And I think, interestingly, I thought about this a lot, like why is Machiavelli's advice so maligned? Also, why is it so timeless? I think it's the same reason. I think Machiavelli removes morality from human relations. And that makes it timeless. It's sort of like looking at power dynamics and government and like a chessboard, which is really useful in a lot of ways, right? Like if you're in a workplace that's like, let's say paying women and people of color less, it's like and you find out that like Ralph, the coworker that like barely produces anything and has only been there for 2 years and you hired him as an intern is making twice your salary. So emotional, but that emotion can really drain your energy. So if you think about, okay, what's the best way to get more money? Well, I know the company wants to think of itself as valuing equality. So what if I went in and just to think about it strategically and to take emotion out of it? It's very useful. On the other hand, like it also prompts Machiavelli to give advice like, if you wrong someone, you should probably kill them because otherwise they're hanging around and they don't like you and they'll probably plot against you. You should probably kill them and their whole family. I mean, it's probably a savvy move, but it's totally amoral. So I think the thing that makes it so special and so timeless and the thing that makes it so sort of chilling is the same thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think that makes it also what makes it so useful to kind of apply to gender in the workplace is that it's kind of just, if you take emotion out of it, you're just playing chess. What are the moves that you need to make that are going to help you win? And so, you have all these really depressing studies, but you also have this useful advice. So kind of after finishing this, you have this book, it's out, yay. Are you optimistic or do you feel like, no, sorry, this is not going to change for a long time?
I am optimistic. I think it is a funny thing, but like, so I've been covering the economy for like 15 years. And I mean, through the housing crisis, through COVID, through a bunch of little ups and downs. I have to say that the US economy, it's such a force, like it's such a powerful force. I am endlessly fascinated by it. It's unfair, it's corrupt in a lot of ways, it's problematic, but it also it's capable of such amazing transformation and it can be harnessed in ways that are just, it is an awesome force in the world. And just having watched things grow and change and transform. When I started my job at Marketplace, Exxon was the largest company in the world. I think of the top 10 companies, like 3 of them are oil companies. Now, no oil companies even listed on the stock exchange. Maybe Chevron is still, but I mean, and it's like tech companies.
Which are all run by men.
Which are all run by men. It's super true. It's true. But just like kind of watching these things change, there's so much transformative power in the economy. And like during COVID, watching all these people start businesses, like just the number of businesses started during COVID is like a record of all time. And that spirit and most of the businesses are now being started by not white men. Most businesses are started by women and people of color now. And I think 17% of Black women are now entrepreneurs, either running a new business or have just started a business. So there's the fact that people react to something like COVID in this country by like starting a business is the thing that makes me optimistic. I feel like there's just this force of like work and kind of relentless effort, which, I mean, it'll wear you out. It's not fair, that effort that's required. I mean, it's a lot of, like, one of the things that I noticed in sort of navigating these situations is like a woman or a person of color, or a marginalized worker, it's just a lot of extra work. You're doing not only your job, but all this work around politicking and all this work making the people who are often committing wrongs against you feel okay about it. I mean, it's a lot of extra work, but I feel like there is a certain like just sort of persistence about people in the US, and that moves things. It moves things. So yes, I'm optimistic.
But then I think, as we've discussed before, if you're a women business owner and you want to expand, you may have to go to a bunch of white guys for money who are going to take over the company. So, maybe it's piece by piece. Women will start businesses and then they'll get access to capital. I think you mentioned a woman with access to capital in your book. But maybe if we talk about when you write your next book in, well, I don't want to say 10 years. When you write your 10th book in 10 years, we'll be seeing that.
Turn into Dan Brown.
Maybe things will be really different. I don't know.
No, I mean, so Alana, you just recently wrote this article for Time Magazine that I loved and was very jealous of, where you were like, I'm just going to buy from female-owned businesses for a week, and just only buy products that are from companies either run by women or that started by women. And it was really, really, really hard. And the reason is that women and people of color just don't have access to capital to grow their businesses. So even though they're starting more businesses, they don't have access to the money that will allow those businesses to grow. So when COVID hit, businesses run by women and minorities were way more likely to close because they just didn't have a cushion. But one thing that did kind of delight me as I was looking into this was that there are now all these, because banks just won't lend them the money, venture capitalists, 98% of venture capital goes to men, 98%.
Crazy.
And bank loans, like small business loans, it's still pretty heavily weighted to white men. But there are all these startups now that because there's so many people starting businesses and such a demand for capital, and so many of the people starting businesses are women and people of color, that now that demand has created there are all these startups that now lend money to small businesses. So essentially, white men are funding startups that are created to lend money to women and people of color because white men won't lend the money. So there is like it's
Carol, you talk about the
roundabout way. And
the power of the American economy.
That is the power of the American economy. There is a buck to be made lending money to women and people of color because they're starting businesses like crazy. So, but it was a very comical sort of circle of life moment for sure.
Well, maybe that's what turns things around, is you can actually make money by lending money to women. Americans, And Americans love to make money, and they love that, opportunity to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. So pull yourself up by your bootstraps by lending to women. Who knew it could help you do well?
Yes, exactly. It's like two wrongs make a possibility,
Right.
Thank you both. That's great. And thank you so much for incorporating the disparity when it comes to race and ethnicity as well as gender, because I think it's there, and it's important to call it out and look for solutions just like anything else. So thanks for definitely bringing that out. I think we did get at least one question in the chat. Do you see that?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So the question is, does any of the advice regarding advancement and pay increase apply when navigating female leaders possibly taking advantage of the status quo?
Female leaders. Oh, you mean if you're asking for a raise from a female boss? I think it's all the same. I mean, you would hope that, someone who has navigated these waters gets into a position of power and makes it easier for the people behind her. This does not always happen. Sometimes there was this thing that, I hate the name for this research, but it comes up in the research a lot. It's called the queen bee syndrome. And it happens in a lot of workplaces where there aren't many women, or basically where there's a feeling of tokenism. It's like, well, I'm the woman, or I'm the person of color. And what it creates is this feeling where it's like, well, I don't want to promote another woman because she's younger than I am and cheaper than I am, and she can use Slack and I can't. And so she's a threat to me, suddenly. And so that can happen. I mean, that's the thing that can happen. So I think often it can be easier to ask for a raise if your boss is like a woman or a person of color, someone who sort of navigated the situation. Not always, though. I would say the advice is the same. I have a chapter in the book because so many of the women I spoke with said, are you going to put a chapter in the book about women who target other women at work? And so I started looking, this is why I even know about the queen bee syndrome and like how to handle these different personalities, because I do think this is something else that happens is, it's sort of this feeling like, et tu brute, like, are you serious? Like why are you giving me trouble? But there can be a lot of things going on, including a feeling of like, well, this is what I went through. It shouldn't be easier for you. And sometimes I feel that towards like young women coming up in radio, and I hope that I know better and don't act on it, but I have those feelings too. I'm like, hey, how come you got that up so fast? Like I had to work for 3 years before, it's just a human, it's a very human feeling. But yeah, I think generally the advice is the same. I think one thing you can employ if you're talking to someone who may come from a background that's similar to yours or have gone through struggles that are maybe similar to the ones you're going through, is you can say, listen, it's really inspiring for me to see like a woman in a leadership position. Like, I know that there aren't very many in the field, and I really look up to you as a role model. Part of the reason that I am, hopeful about my own future at this company is because of people like you. And in order to stay at this company, though, I do want to feel fairly valued, and I want to feel like I'm being valued on par with our male colleagues. And, it's just like a little, it's true, but it's a little bit of guilt, but it's also kind of, it's instead of an antagonistic, like there can be only one woman in leadership, you're sort of saying like, you inspire me. We are in this together, and just kind of emphasizing that connectivity, which is one of the things that I think is a good thing to do in negotiation anyway.
Again, it's not a zero-sum game.
Yes, ideally.
Well, thank you both so much. Here is the book, if we didn't show it prominently enough, Machiavelli for Women. Thank you so much, Alana and Stacey. Please come to Book Passage or call us or go online to receive a copy of this book. It is very, I thought when I saw the cover and the title and the topic, like there would be something kind of dense about it or heady. But I got to say, as I was reading through it, it's very accessible. and readable. Like I found myself putting little bookmarks in different sections, but just very easy to navigate. And it's practical and well written.
And very funny, I have to add.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much. And thank you for everybody who came live and for those who are going to be watching later. We really appreciate you coming to this event. I know you're going to be inspired and learn so much from this topic. Please do feel free to call or come by Book Passage. We'd love to give you this book as well as many, many other books. And once again, thank you to our guests today. We really appreciate your time and really helping us navigate these spaces, these male-dominated spaces. Yeah, it's all still so kind of surprising, but it really shouldn't be, I guess. Right. But I feel like with information that you're giving us, we can make it through and make a difference.
I hope so. Thank you. I'm glad you found the book easy to read. I tried to make it funny and easy to read to like help some of the information go down a little more easily. So I'm glad it was like I'm glad it felt readable.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks for having us. Bye.